Before I tell you what happened to them, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some places feel quiet in a way that doesn't feel natural? Not peaceful, not calm, just empty, like something left, but forgot to take its eyes with it. Out in the middle of the sea, there's a lighthouse that still stands. No ships pass near it, no boats anchor around it, and yet, every few nights, its light turns on. No one remembers who maintains it. No records explain why it was never dismantled, and the last people who tried to document it never uploaded their footage. What makes this story unsettling isn't what they saw inside that lighthouse. It's what followed them after they left. Because some places don't want visitors. They want witnesses. And once you've been seen, the light never really turns off. They weren't reckless people. That's important to understand. They were careful, methodical, and oddly thoughtful for vloggers who chased abandoned places. Their channel wasn't loud or flashy. No fake reactions. No screaming thumbnails. Just two friends talking calmly into a camera, documenting places the world had slowly forgotten. They believed silence was honest. Crowded cities lied. Tourist spots performed. But empty places? Those told the truth. Or at least, that's what they thought. When a location had been left alone long enough, it stopped pretending. Walls cracked honestly. Floors groaned without warning. Nature reclaimed what humans couldn't control. That belief shaped every trip they took. One of them was the planner. Maps, tides, weather reports, battery backups. The other was the observer. The one who noticed small details, strange patterns, moments that didn't quite fit. Together, they balanced each other. Logic and instinct, reason and curiosity. When they first heard about the lighthouse, it sounded perfect, remote, off the coast, not listed as active, barely mentioned online. A place untouched by trends or crowds. A place where silence wasn't edited, it just existed. They told themselves they'd stay one night, just enough to capture the atmosphere, just enough to feel like they were somewhere no one else had been. They didn't go looking for danger. They went looking for quiet, and that was the mistake. They first saw the lighthouse at dusk. From the shore, it looked unreal. Too distant to feel solid, too still to feel abandoned. It stood alone on a stretch of dark rock, surrounded by water that moved differently around it, slower somehow, like the sea hesitated to touch it. As they got closer by boat, the air changed. The temperature dropped just enough to notice. The smell of salt mixed with something older, metal, maybe, or damp stone that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The waves that had rocked the boat moments earlier grew calm, almost careful, as if noise wasn't allowed here. The lighthouse tower was taller than they expected, not wide, not grand, just narrow and vertical, stretching upward with a quiet confidence. The white paint had faded into a sickly gray. Rust streaked down from bolts and railings like dried blood. The windows were dark, but not empty. They reflected the sea perfectly, as if the tower was watching itself from every angle. No birds circled above. No insects buzzed near the rocks. And then there was the light chamber at the top. The glass was clean, clear, untouched by storms or salt. It looked maintained. Recently, they told themselves it meant nothing. Old places often fooled the eye. But when they reached the door, heavy, iron, and cold to the touch, it opened without resistance. Unlocked, one of them hesitated, just for a second, feeling an unexplainable pressure in his chest. A quiet urge to turn around, to leave the way they came. Instead, they stepped inside, and the door closed behind them on its own. Inside, the lighthouse smelled wrong. Not rotten, not moldy, just old in a way that felt preserved, like time had been sealed instead of passing. The air was cool but stale, pressing against their skin as if the tower hadn't breathed in years and didn't plan to start now. Their footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase, but the sound didn't behave normally. Each step came back softer than it should have, as if the walls were absorbing noise instead of reflecting it. The observer noticed it first. He stopped walking, listening. When the sound faded too quickly, he laughed it off and kept moving. They always laugh things off. The interior was cleaner than expected. No collapsed beams, no bird nests, no signs of decay you'd expect from a structure abandoned to the sea. The metal railings were cold and smooth. The walls showed faint scratches, long, uneven lines that looked intentional but meaningless. They told themselves it was erosion. Old repairs. Nothing more. As they climbed higher, their sense of direction began to blur. The stairs felt longer than the outside height of the tower should allow. The planner checked his watch. Only a few minutes had passed, yet it felt like much longer. He blamed adrenaline. New places always warp time a little. They reached a small landing halfway up. A single narrow window faced the ocean. The sky outside had darkened faster than expected, clouds rolling in thick and low. The sea was almost perfectly still now, like glass. That's when they noticed the sound. A low hum. Not mechanical, not electrical. Something deeper. Something rhythmic. It seemed to come from above and below, and nowhere specific at all. They stood there, listening, unsure how long they'd been frozen in place. Then the hum stopped, and the lighthouse light turned on. They hadn't touched anything. There was no power source they could see, and according to every record they'd checked, that light hadn't been active for years. The observer swallowed hard and said, they decided to wait. That choice felt reasonable in the moment. The sea outside had turned black, the sky sealed shut by clouds that swallowed what little light remained. Leaving now meant navigating sharp rocks and unfamiliar water in complete darkness. Staying felt safer. Logical. So they set up near the middle level of the tower, away from the light chamber above, away from the door below. The space felt neutral, like a compromise. Their equipment picked up almost nothing. No wind noise. No distant waves. The silence on the audio was so clean it felt artificial. As night settled in, the lighthouse began to feel larger. The spiral staircase stretched farther than it had earlier. The curve of the walls felt tighter, then wider, then tight again, never consistent. When one of them leaned against the railing, it felt colder than before, like it had been exposed to open air instead of sealed stone. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time one of them closed his eyes, he felt watched. Not from a single point, but from all directions at once. The observer eventually sat up, staring into the dark, listening. He heard soft movements above them, slow, careful, like footsteps being placed with intention. When he whispered his friend's name, the sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong inside the tower. The planner was awake too. He admitted he'd been hearing something different. A faint scraping sound, not metal, not stone, something softer, repeating in uneven intervals, like fingers brushing against the wall. They tried to rationalize it. Thermal shifts, old materials adjusting, sound carrying oddly in enclosed spaces. They'd explained away worse before, but then the light above them changed. It didn't brighten or dim. It slowed. Each rotation took longer than the last, dragging its beam across the narrow windows like it was searching. The shadows inside the tower stretched unnaturally, twisting into shapes that made their eyes linger too long. That's when they realized something unsettling. The light wasn't moving in a perfect circle anymore. It was hesitating, pausing briefly at certain points, as if it had found something worth looking at. And for the first time that night, neither of them reached for the camera. They just sat there, breathing quietly, hoping that whatever was moving through the lighthouse hadn't noticed them yet. At some point, the beam stopped behaving like light at all. It no longer swept the tower in a steady rhythm. Instead, it dragged itself across the walls, thick and heavy, as if it had weight. When it passed the narrow windows, the inside of the lighthouse didn't brighten the way it should have. The glow felt dull, muffled, like it was being swallowed before it could reach them. The observer noticed something first. Their shadows didn't line up. When the beam passed, the shadows on the wall appeared a fraction of a second too late. And when they did appear, they stretched in directions that didn't match where either of them was standing. One shadow bent slightly upward, as if pulled by an unseen force. The other seemed to tilt its head, even though neither of them moved. They stopped breathing. The planner slowly raised his hand, testing the light. His shadow followed, but something else lagged behind it, thinner, elongated, clinging to the wall before melting away. He dropped his arm immediately, heart pounding so loud it felt impossible that nothing else could hear it. A sound rose from the staircase above them. Not footsteps, not scraping, breathing, slow, shallow, too close. The observer pressed his back against the wall, feeling the stone vibrate faintly, as if the tower itself were alive. The breathing didn't get louder or softer. It just stayed, present, acknowledging them without approaching. Then the light paused again, this time directly on their level. The beam lingered at the window, pouring in sideways, cutting across the room like a blade. For a split second, something interrupted it. A shape, tall, narrow, not solid, but darker than the darkness around it. Gone before either of them could react. They stared at the empty space, waiting for their minds to catch up with what their eyes had seen. No one spoke, because once you say it out loud, it becomes real. And whatever was sharing the lighthouse with them had just proven one thing. It could see them. And it didn't need a face to do it. The night stretched on. Nothing moved violently. No doors slammed. No windows shattered. Yet the feeling of presence grew heavier with every passing hour. It wasn't a spirit that announced itself. It was a weight, a pressure that pressed on their chests, whispered to their ears, and lingered just beyond the corner of vision. Small things shifted. A cup, perfectly balanced, tilted slightly as they weren't looking. Paper on the floor moved in a faint ripple. A shadow flickered along the railing when they swore it hadn't been there a second ago. One friend swore he heard a voice. Not words, just a low sigh, almost human, almost pleading, almost warning. He turned, and the staircase above them was empty. Time began to fracture. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like seconds. The planner tried to check his watch. It spun wildly, the hands jerking forward and backward. The observer swore he saw his own reflection in the window, but it wasn't quite him. It smiled when he didn't. They never saw the ghost directly. They never wanted to. It existed in the spaces between light and shadow, in the pauses of sound, in the moments they weren't looking, but always watching. And the longer they stayed, the more they began to doubt themselves. Was it real? Or were they losing their minds? Either answer was terrifying. By the time the first fog rolled in from the sea, they realized the lighthouse wasn't abandoned at all. It had been waiting. On a narrow landing halfway up, the observer found it first, a notebook wedged behind a rusted railing. Pages yellowed with age, scribbled in uneven handwriting. Words that didn't make sense at first. Symbols. Lines crossed out. A map of the tower, drawn over and over, always ending with the same spot, at the top, near the light. The planner discovered markings etched into the walls. They weren't random. Some were numbers. Some were letters. All were arranged in sequences that felt almost ritualistic. The scratches were old, but the edges were sharp, recent enough that someone, or something, had been here not long ago. Then came the sound, low, deliberate, like metal scraping stone, but it wasn't machinery. The staircase creaked as if someone, or something, was pacing above them, moving just out of sight. It hit them suddenly. The lighthouse wasn't a guide for ships. It was a watcher, and whatever had been inside had been keeping something contained, something that now knew they had entered. They weren't intruders. They were witnesses, and witnesses were never supposed to leave. Panic didn't start with a scream. It started with the realization that they weren't in control. The spiral staircase seemed longer than ever, twisting impossibly, as if the tower itself had reshaped while they weren't looking. Every step echoed, but the sound never followed them the same way twice. Shadows clung to the railings, stretching into forms they didn't recognize. They ran, not fast at first, careful, calculating, then faster, when the floorboards groaned beneath them and a low hum rose behind their backs. It wasn't the light, not the wind, not the sea, something deliberate, moving just out of reach. The planner tried to reach the door, only to find it further away than it had been minutes ago. The observer nearly slipped on wet stone that had appeared from nowhere. They shouted each other's names, but their voices sounded hollow, swallowed by the lighthouse itself. When they finally burst out onto the black rocks, the sea churned angrily, waves slamming in patterns that didn't make sense. The lighthouse loomed behind them, silent now, its light extinguished, or so they thought. They didn't stop running until they reached the boat. The engine barely started. The oars felt heavy, sluggish, like the water itself resisted their escape. And all the while, in the darkness, a presence seemed to follow, gliding over the waves without sound. They were free, and yet, neither of them could shake the feeling that the lighthouse had already chosen its next move. Because some places don't release what they've seen. They made it back to the shore, soaked and shivering, hearts pounding like war drums. They swore they were done. Never again. Never looking back. Never speaking of it. For a few hours, the world seemed normal. The wind, the waves, even the distant calls of seabirds, all familiar. Relief began to settle, fragile, but real. But then one of them noticed it, a reflection in the water. At first, he thought it was the lighthouse's beam, reaching across the waves. But there was no light up there. No rotation. Nothing had moved since they left. And yet there it was. A tall, narrow shadow, gliding just beneath the surface. not attached to anything, not mirrored in the moonlight, just following, waiting, watching. They tried to convince themselves it was imagination, fatigue, stress, but deep down they knew. Whatever had been in the lighthouse hadn't stayed behind. It had left with them. And when they looked at each other, eyes wide with the same wordless terror, they realized the unthinkable truth. The story wasn't over. Because some witnesses never escape, some lights never turn off, and some ghosts don't need a face to know who you are.